We've discussed them through and through. We know everything that is to know about active citizenship, so you guys can figure it out yourselves. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. As a moderator of 3 panels in a row, I think I'm going to have to start at a certain moment to actually think about the questions that I'm going to ask. And in this particular conversation, the questions are very critical, because everything else we've discussed through the day, whether local cultures, community building, trust, identity, value, quality of life, health, and building a culture for, or at least trying to build a culture for the good life, as the classics called it, means very little if the social matrix is not both responsive, responsible, and resilient. And I think this panel is probably ideally suited to discuss some of the issues related to active citizenship, citizenship in general, and how individually and collectively, but ultimately as a society, we're capable of using some of the tools that the current technological and communication framework offers us. And the 3 panelists today are each and every one of them bringing to the table a certain very specific experience. Whether Sam van de Staak, who's head of Wider Europe program, An International Idea, Meelika Hirmo, who's head of public relations and communications for Let's Do It, and Andrei Pungovschi, who's a photographer and photojournalist. With that, I think I'm going to start with you, Sam van de Staak, to talk a little bit about how citizenship changes, how active citizenship and our definition of active citizenship has changed over the past couple of decades. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. No, I thought the title for this seminar was extremely interesting, because when we talk about active citizenship, I think we're talking really about a shift. For decades, we've talked about how citizens are actually less active than they used to be. So all the formal institutions where citizens are supposed to participate, be it elections, membership of political parties, membership of trade unions and civil society organizations, that's all going down. Since the 1980s, 1990s, I think an average of about 20% in electoral turnout reduction. Political party membership has halved since the 1980s in Europe. Trade union membership across Europe is currently at 17% only. We heard this afternoon in Romania it's only 3%. And all these problems, I think, are very recognizable in most countries. There's no exception. So actually, when we talk about active citizenship, we are seeing that in a certain type of participation that citizens have, it looks really bad. But at the same time, at the other end of the scale, we see more and more street protests. Actually, since 2006, we see that 4 times as many street protests have happened around the world, is what an important study tells us. And that can be anything from the Occupy Wall Street in the US and the UK, the Indignados in Spain. We have seen street protests in Poland very recently over all kinds of democratic reforms, and so on and so forth. So we see that a lot of citizens are not less active, but active in a different way. Of course, there's the online participation. People voice their concerns, voice their opinions much more easily than they used to, which is sometimes referred to as clicktivism. So a pun on the word activism, people prefer to click instead of participate directly. So the type of activism of citizens is shifting. And by doing that, I think the whole notion of politics is changing. It's what some people have called the Uberization of politics. So Uber, as many of you will know it, is a taxi sharing app, right? A small anecdote, I was being picked up from the airport yesterday, and the person driving the car tells me, don't take taxis when you're in Bucharest. So I ask him, why are they not reliable? He says, well, no, but also the Uber taxis are better, they're nice cars. and they're more accurate. So you pay exactly the kilometers that you travel. I did it at night. First time I ever used Uber in my life was here in Romania. It was fantastic. I got a driver who doesn't speak English. I don't speak Romanian. Still, we managed to find each other. He had a nice bottle of water for me, drove me around the parliament, dropped me off at my hotel. And we didn't exchange money because it all happens online. Now, that process of sort of instant communication between individuals is what we're seeing in politics as well, the Uberization of politics. Citizens are more and more looking for direct ways to interact with those that, whose services they need. And they're calling for that type of engagement in politics as much as they do in all kinds of other services. The Uberization of politics is then what people call it. It's a shift that is fundamentally changing the nature of politics as we know it, the representation that we have always known when we talk about politics and sort of who does the politics on our behalf as citizens. And over the next couple of years, I think that will define what politics around the world looks like. What is the balance between the amount of power that we keep in our hands as citizens and the amount of power that we outsource to other people, to politicians that have traditionally taken decisions on our behalf. So we live in interesting times, and I think the Uberization of politics is something that we are seeing happen, the outcome we don't know about.
So you talk about participation and voice and how those are shaped by the current communication framework. And you say that this are fundamentally impacting the way politics is going to be done, both in terms of what the public's going to want and how the body politic responds to this. We're going to come back to those, and I have a few questions. But before that, Meelika, there are very few brands of international activism that have stemmed from our region. And to have a brand that comes from a relatively small country in a post-Soviet world that has a fractured culture of civic engagement was not what people expected. People know, the Greenpeace and the major green organization of the world, but Let's Do It had a different, if you want, physiology. It had a different DNA, and it's part of its success and also its replicability rests on the fact that it's not a classical organization. In a sense, it's very much what Sam said, a new type of idea, project, and organization. Feel free to talk about those things.
Yeah, when the idea of Let's Do It was born, which was to clean up entire Estonia in just one day, in 2007, everybody thought it was impossible. And back then we didn't have any juridical organization. Remember, Greenpeace is an organization created in the 70s. So they've been growing over the course of many, many years. And then suddenly a bunch of crazy people thought that let's not have a safe 5-year plan, 3-year plan, 2-year plan, whatever. Let's do it in one day, because nobody has patience to be invested in something like trash for such a long course of time. And what happened was that Estonia was cleaned up in only 5 hours. If the government would have done this, it would have costed the government 22.5 million euros, and it would have taken the government 3 years of time. Government equals taxpayers, us. But we did the whole campaign, including all the waste management and recycling and transportation, and including the biggest media campaign Estonia ever had, in, like I said, in only 500,000 euros, 500,000. So we saved the taxpayer 22 million euros. Talk about efficiency of volunteering and resource management. It only took people, most of the people, 5 hours, some of the local leaders a bit more, but we saved a lot of time and energy, and all of these 50,000 people, which is 4% of Estonia's population, got a positive volunteering experience. When I show up, something can actually change. We didn't clean up part of Estonia. We didn't clean up here, there, in this city. We cleaned up really the whole country in just 5 hours. And it took a lot of preparation, of course, logistic, Skype, creators of Skype were involved, top professionals. And back then we had no idea that this is going to go viral. We did a video and thought, oh, maybe it will inspire someone, maybe somebody else would like to do the same thing. And people started writing us, can we clean up our country as well? We were laughing like, yeah, sure, it's your country, go ahead. But they didn't leave us be and asked, okay, but how, and how did you do that, and what were the challenges? And of course, there were many. For instance, in the beginning, the waste management companies were not happy about it at all because somebody else is dealing with their business. And some politicians, after the campaign started, thought that we are going to form a party. They were thinking that we are political, but not. We were not even done with the cleanup day when the neighboring countries, Latvia and Lithuania, heard about it and wanted to do the same. And their campaign was basically, don't be slower than Estonians. Because they make jokes about Estonians being super slow, and the way I speak, you understand, it's all true. I'm speaking very slowly. But it spread around, and even then we didn't have a clear plan that, okay, let's try to make it global. It went global like social media sometimes. You post something and it somehow goes out of your reach. And we made the whole campaign, even in Estonia, before Facebook was everywhere in Europe. We made all the materials, like design materials, everything available for everybody. We gave the brand free, which caused that people actually accepted it as their own. Mm-hmm. So it was also like some sort of a sharing economy, because when you share, you have to give up some of the control, like the corporate way of doing your branding and communication. So that was very challenging, and somehow it happened in other countries as well, and soon Romania followed the suit and had its own cleanup day with the same logo. And for us it was of course very weird to see that happening, because we didn't believe this would come. And we are now in a network in 112 countries, and Let's Do It actions have involved 14 million participants, and we are even planning to grow bigger. And so we are now one of the fastest growing civic actions, with the challenge of this online society, like click society, where people think that I'm clicking, sharing, or signing a petition, then my civic duty is done. We have to get all these people who are online, offline, in 2018 on the 8th of September, when we plan to organize this massive World Cleanup Day with 150 countries on board on the very same day. And that's very crazy. Like always, Let's Do It has been crazy. So it's also my birthday, so I invite you all to mark in your calendars that you're invited in my birthday anywhere you are in the world on 8th of September. Clean up some waste, and I will be very grateful. So yeah, these things happen more and more. I think that you start something, the word goes around, and people adapt it as own. And yeah.
Thank you. I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but before that, Andrei, all these stories, whether a civic engagement in the Netherlands or Romania or Let's Do It, need a story. And in the contemporary way of telling stories has become very visual, or again has become very visual, going back to the origin of mankind and kind of putting it on a wall of a cave. Now we think in those visual narrative terms. What happens with the model Sam told us about is that we're exposed to all these images, ideas, realities, and we become to some extent inured. We become insensitive to those realities. They happen on the internet. They don't happen in real life. And even when we do, we need something to kind of break that glass, whether it's a touch screen or you know, or a display, to understand that that's my reality. That's something I as a citizen need to react to. What role does image play into that, and how can we actually make it happen?
Well, I'm not very sure exactly how we can make it happen, because if I was sure, I probably would be rich. But, and first of all, I have to let you guys know that when I'm pulling out my phone, I'm not checking Facebook. That's how I'm taking notes from what you're saying. I have several answers to your question, and I'm going to base all of them on a relatively recent trip that I've taken. It started last year in August when, along with two friends of mine, I followed the refugee route. So we went to Izmir in Turkey, and we did the whole route all the way to northern Germany. It took us 5 weeks. Well, we crossed the sea by ferry because the smugglers wouldn't take us. So I have several examples to answer your question in terms of how images can actually play a role. Before I left for Turkey, I had been using Instagram for about 3 years. And I was relatively happy with, I don't know, 3,000 something followers, which for a photographer from Eastern Europe, I would say would be decent. A few days after we got to Lesbos on the Greek island, I would post every day photos that I would take. And a few days after we reached Lesbos, something happened. I noticed my followers going up in crazy numbers. So remember, in 3 years, I had 3,000 followers. After I reached Lesbos, I would get 3,000 or 4,000 followers per day. So a couple of weeks into the trip, I reached 49,000 followers. And I was really, really surprised, and I didn't know what happened. I still don't know exactly what happened, but I have an idea. I think that a few times the Instagram admin reposted a photo. And then I had read, I think in The Guardian, that there was this whole communication infrastructure used by refugees, specific websites, Facebook pages, and Instagram accounts that they used as guiding points before or during their trip. And I think someone posted my account sort of like a diary. So I looked at the followers, and most of them were from Arab countries. So I imagined that they were using my trip to get an idea of what's coming. So that was one thing that I found interesting. But then again, speaking about the efficiency of images, many times people point a finger at photographers for taking photos of kids from different perspectives. If you take the Western European perspectives, they say that it's an intrusion. If you go on the other side into the media, they would say, well, that's just a cliche and it's an easy picture to make. Whatever reason, some of us do tend to stay away from images of children. I'm not sure if someone's working the technical side now, because I had a bunch of images that I wanted to show you. Okay, so if we can pull up my website and go to the category children, this was the first time that I photographed children. Mm-hmm. And we can go through the images, first of all, because there are not too many. And you can see the trip of the refugees through images of what happens to children in particular. You can just go one by one. Hopefully. So this was Lesbos. So this was the moment they would get off the boat and onto dry land. And the reason why I thought this would be appropriate is because this, I think, images of children in this context have the emotional power to engage Europeans. Because you'd have to think you'd have to ask yourself what would make a parent put a kid through this situation. And then maybe we can begin to understand and hopefully look at these people through a different perspective. So we can keep going through the images real quick. So this is, again, just getting off the boat and to safety.
Relative safety.
Relative safety, yes. This is a grandmother who was looking after her grandson. This was an Afghan family and the only Greek policeman I've seen in a couple of days. This is a train station in Croatia, on the border between Croatia and Serbia, and these kids were improvising and playing with the rocks in between the train tracks, using them as toys. This is Croatia-Hungary border. And this was on the Hungarian border when the police fought with the refugees, with the Hungarian police.
The color of the Hungarian flag.
Almost, yeah.
White, green, red.
So the reason why I chose these photos were to try to target and somehow shake the viewer. Because otherwise you would see the same pictures over and over again. People carrying stuff with their belongings, looking desperate. But that was it. I thought that maybe by choosing pictures of children, somehow I can create or attempt to create an emotional connection with the European viewer. If it worked or not, I don't know. That's very hard to quantify. And this is already in Western Europe. This is Vienna in the train station. Yeah, so we can take this down.
Andrei, let me ask you something. You say, I chose these images because I hoped and I expected them to have impact. So in that sense, you use them as instruments in getting a result. What was the result you were looking for? And who was your audience?
Well, primarily, first of all, when I went there, I just wanted to see for myself. But then I'm not just going to take pictures that are going to stay on my hard drives. So my primary audience would be, let's say, Romanians, and then Europeans who would get in contact with these people. And if there was anything I was hoping to obtain from these series of images, would be a change of attitude. I'm not sure that's possible, but that's what I was looking for. I was trying to show maybe a slightly different story than what you normally see on TV. Because TV, that was also one of the reasons why I went. Because everything I saw on TV was generalizations, putting all the refugees under one umbrella. And the only thing I concluded at the end of this trip, the only thing they had in common, and I talked about it with several journalists who have done the same route. The only thing that you can say that they share is how different they are, how different their backgrounds are and their personal histories. And after you talk to them, you understand these things. And hopefully, some of these images will convey some of that.
The reason I'm asking this, because I want to take it back to where Sam and Meelika left us in the thread of the conversation, meaning that ultimately, active citizenship, whether as reaction to current events, when they're offered in a form that people are bound to react to, or hopefully bound to react to, or often a smart idea to react, or given the tool to engage as networked individuals, is political. And when I say political, I'm not necessarily meaning it in an ideological, left, right sense, but definitely political. And when you say that you received questions whether this is going to be a political party, a political movement, and you say that politics itself reacts to a civic engagement and active citizenship of this sort, what you mean is that the effectiveness of such a movement already is a political statement, as opposed to, and it's often the case, the ineffective nature of state reaction or response, or the politicization of issues like immigration and a success of that discourse. Now, the question to you all is, we live in at times when populist discourse and frankly, extremist ideas are getting a lot of traction. They're using exactly the same mechanism. How do you draw the line? How do you separate from the good guys and the bad guys? Is this question even valid or relevant?
I'm not going to pretend to have the answer to this. This is the way we all seem to cover our asses on this stage, but it's also true. I think listening to the other two presenters, fascinating stories that they tell, but they also reveal that a lot of the things that are going on in the world, especially the images we just saw on the screen, are too important and too complex not to politicize. And there's many things happening in the world today. There's civil wars in Syria, in Libya. There's Euro crisis happening in Greece, all very complex problems that cannot be solved through a click on a mouse.
Again, famine in East Africa, in the same places that we've had it 20 and 30 years ago.
So you will need politics to some extent, and you will need political parties to some extent. But what I see is happening is that citizen movements are becoming more and more like political parties because they feel that that's where the ultimate decisions are being taken. Whereas political parties are moving more towards protest movements, citizen movements, because they see that that's where the citizens sit, that's where the support sits, and they feel that they need to reconnect to the citizens because that's what they've lost over the past couple of decades. So we see the whole field shifting of political parties becoming more like citizen movements, and they are adopting all the technologies. Obama, of course, was very famous in his Blue State Digital campaign, where he used social media, but also very targeted ways to really know where his voters sit and really engage with them on a personal basis. But there's many more. There's all kinds of online voting apps that political parties are using, policy-making apps. So all these apps that started with civil society are now also being used by political parties. International Idea recently collected all of them, now sits on a search engine, digitalparties.org. So all of that is available now. On the other side, we see that political parties, new political parties like Podemos in Spain, like the Five Star Movement in Italy, have grown, are born out of a social movement and a protest movement, and they are successful. So they were successful on the streets, but they are now also successful in parliament. Last Sunday, not only Romania had municipal elections, also Rome, and the party that came out on top was the Five Star Movement, which started as a blog by a popular comedian. Next door in Moldova, there's also a protest movement that is now becoming a political party. It's happening really everywhere. So the field is moving towards each other. And we all seem to want to be like the other side. I think the important lesson to draw is where does the citizen actions stop and where does the politics begin? I think it's important that political parties know their role in society and that they don't try to be too much like something they are not. Because if you take the politics out of a political party too much, then it becomes dangerous. You need politics to make decisions in society.
Meelika?
Well, I've been involved in democracy projects as well, and one of the actions in Estonia, it's not international yet, but Let's Do It Foundation has a project called Citizen.os, where we are upgrading democracy, because let's think about how the modern democracy has been developed. 150 years ago, it was very natural that some farmer from somewhere wouldn't travel to the city to vote. In Estonia, we have had e-voting next to other means as well since 2005, and internet banking for 15 years in a level that I see now in some of the other countries where I've lived is reaching. So there is online methods to make participation easier. And I'm also seeing that the fact that democracy should change if the society is changing, because the information society that we are living now is so complex. If we delegate our vote to one person for 4 or 5 years who has to decide everything for me about education, economy, migration, anything basically, arts, culture, it's very unrealistic to expect that one politician, no matter talented, is capable of being really involved in all those areas. So the delegative democracy, what we are trying to develop now, is going to meet with the direct democracy, so that you can anonymously delegate your vote to any expert you want, and the expert doesn't know. For instance, if there is this aspect I feel not so secure about, and I feel that he knows better than I delegate my vote to him, he doesn't even know it, and maybe 1,000 more people do the same, because he's an expert. And it's very hard to manipulate such a person by lobbyists or by companies, because they have no idea how many votes he has. But for one certain parliament member, you can very easily, I'm not saying it's a solution, but it's a different way of thinking, and it makes, in a way, a lot of sense considering how the society is changing really fast, and we are not living in 1940 anymore.
I'm sure there's somebody developing an app to establish who gets how many delegates in that, or delegations in that respect, but
even with voting, regular voting, there are so much corruption and cheating,
totally.
and there are people watching and still don't manage to prove.
The question in that respect becomes, are we just responsive to a change in a technological underpinning of the society, or does this go deeper? Is this really a new stage in civic engagement? And that we are, in fact, though many people saw a crisis, in fact we're becoming more civic and more capable of acting as concerned citizens. Andrei, what's your take on this?
I'm going to use the same example of the refugee crisis, because that's where I noticed something very interesting, which is the democratization of social media. If in the beginning I was saying that, let's say, the refugees were using Instagram accounts to gather information and Facebook to spread routes and borders and stuff, 5 weeks later I was in Dresden in northeastern Germany, attending a 15,000 people protest organized by the Pegida movement against the refugees. And the way I got that information, because my German is very basic, I mean beer and food, and in order to gather information about that, to attempt to cover it somewhat objectively, I went to the same places, social media, and I found that they have an Instagram account, Pegida, a Facebook account, a website, and I could use the same type of tools that the refugees were using to make their way easier to find information about the right-wing movement in Germany. And this parallel was interesting to me, because I thought, well, if these guys can use this to make their way faster to Western Europe, at the same time, the other people, whether you agree with them or not, can use exactly the same type of tools to try to counter the arrival of the new inhabitants.
Final question before we open up to the audience. We've talked about technology, we've talked about political response to this, we've talked about how people get organized in vast numbers and how these ideas travel, how they serve as inspiration for other countries or other communities, and they're picked up. Now the question to you is, when do we know that this has had an impact? In the case of Let's Do It, 5 hours, though there were many more hours in mapping the locations, etc., etc. So a lot of volunteering that goes behind the scene. And there are examples in Romania about illegal logging, and the model has kind of created, through grassroots organization, various different versions of it. But when do we know that this has reached a point of no return, a point of massive scale? Or is that even a valid question? Should we not look for that because it's going to change every 10 years or so, because the rate of societal change is so important that we can't really predict what are the tools, the social movements or the social methods that are going to be applicable 10 years from now. And my final comment, the reason I'm asking this is that Andrei and I last met, let's call it in field, in Kiev during Maidan. And that was a movement that, like the Tahrir Square, survived the cutting of internet, survived the moment where technology wasn't available. using the same method of organization but offline?
Shall I give it a start? to the difficult questions again. I think it's very difficult to know what it will look like in 10 years. First of all, I think we are seeing the impact. It's not just something in our heads or something we discuss in talk shops like this. Right. We do see the massive increase in protests across Europe, across the world. So we do see that citizens respond differently to different incentives than what they used to. We see that some politicians...
in Paris.
Sorry?
Nuit debout in Paris and other movements that...
Exactly, everywhere. We see that social media and all kinds of digital tools are helping to achieve that. And we are also seeing that political parties are increasingly adopting them. Some successfully. Again, Obama is always used as the example, but now also Podemos and the Five Star Movement and the traditional parties, the mainstream parties, are also sort of coming on board. I advise political parties that they don't have the luxury to wait 10 years to see whether this is something that will disappear and something new will come on board or not. They have to start adopting social media, but all types of internet and IT that exists out there, because if they don't do it now, they lose their relevance. And they're at a point of time where they are in a global crisis, established political parties. They are losing the trust of citizens. In fact, they have already lost the trust of citizens.
Andrei, the same thing applies to media, and you're a journalist, through and through. So what does that entail for media? And this is not a panel that looks into communication in a sense of what's the future of media, what business model, but really when it comes to this connection between citizens, information sources and politics, how is this going to play out? And what's the responsibility of the individual journalist in that respect?
Well, the responsibility of the individual journalist comes down to something very hard to define, which is called common sense, which, as you know, depends on everyone's personal background. You cannot have you can try to have a code of ethics and whatever, but it's still going to come down to common sense. In terms of how our work affects either the politicians' decisions or regular people's attitudes, that is very, very difficult to quantify. Unfortunately, it's only visible when there's something truly dramatic happening. And again, if I'm going to use the same example, I'm going to remind you of the picture of the Syrian child on the shore. And that was one particular example where things were shaken. But besides spectacular and truly dramatic situations, it is very, very difficult for us to quantify the result of our work. So I don't have any black and white answers. It's all gray.
Meelika, do you see a movement of the type you've put together in Let's Do It impacting also the world of business? So not just the way society reacts to societal problems, but creating simply a different ecosystem for businesses to evolve in.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've discussed, and when you read new literature about modern businesses, they are more and more like movements. They are less and less with this strong, tough hierarchy, especially in the modern areas of industry. IT, for instance, you see these startups that grow really fast, become really successful. They often don't have this dynamic of 9 to 5 obligations. It's all teamwork. And then Let's Do It, we in Let's Do It still try to become more like an organization, because we are an organization, but keep our movement psychology and qualities. And as we mostly work with volunteers, it's running volunteers, and to take maximum out of them is much more harder than to oblige someone by salary and contract. But the modern generation people in the labor force are completely different. They switch jobs really fast. They're very well adapted, and their biggest motivation is not salary or position, but what they can do and how much freedom they have. That's the Y generation and the following generations that make it absolutely impossible to continue old school leadership. So basically the companies already see that the civic society is the new model for many, many organizations in the private sector as well. And the more we cooperate with them, in Let's Do It, we cooperate a lot, the more they become similar to us as well, actually. I've seen it with my own eyes. And
just a quick follow-up question, and it's valid to all of you. Don't hate me. We're here a panel of white people, so to speak, talking in affluent Europe, even if this is in Eastern Europe, in a relatively poor country, in a hierarchy of 28. But what would be your reaction to a statement saying, yes, but that applies to Western, affluent, educated, connected individuals, and that you have another half of the world population that has access to none of those, and that is thus underserved by the political movements, by their own tools, and they're somehow left behind, not just in the digital divide, but in a citizenship divide?
I actually would disagree, because we see examples with Let's Do It. Afghanistan held a Let's Do It cleanup. Of course, it was a pilot in 10 provinces. For us, when they said that, our first reaction was terrifying, totally being scared, because what if something happens to these people? And it was what actually happened. A day before the cleanup day in Kabul, 4 suicide attacks happened and 40 people were killed. We, of course, suggested quit, stop, don't do anything. And they said, no, we discussed with our community. If everything is torn apart with war, you need something where people still have something to say, something to change. So something like, if you simplify these so-called difficult processes to people, everybody can participate. And not everyone can lead immediately, because they need to grow to be a leader. But if there is a bunch of leaders, and which there are in every country in the world, and if they take the responsibility and if they are supported, then things can happen, because a lot of people want to follow. They are looking for the opportunities to be engaged. So we see that from Afghanistan or even Ukraine in 2014, 2015. That was the highest rapid rise in the participating numbers in Let's Do It. 500,000 people cleaning up, which, considering the situation, we couldn't believe in the beginning. So I think that the society, global society, is ready. It's just that you need to give those tools. And when you look at Africa, most people maybe not having any TV, but they have phones. They're tweeting and on Facebook, so active, that maybe more active than we are. And let's also go back to the Eastern Europe. In 1991, we were basically like an African country, and still civic society could thrive, at least in Estonia, when there was the singing revolution in the end of 80s, or the Baltic chain, when throughout 3 countries people held hands, making a border between the Soviet border and the real border. So it's nothing to do with money, and education is of course important, but that's what the leaders, civic leaders, have to take in their shoulders to build a new generation of leaders.
Questions, reactions, comments? Sergey? There's a microphone coming. Or maybe not. Sure.
Just one remark and one question. One remark, there was a recently book about all those movements that actually disappear after they start exploring or reflecting on themselves. So they are normally effective when they're against something, but when it comes to who we are, who is our leader and so on, so they disappear. But the point was that made in this book, The Moral Blindness by Zygmunt Bauman and Leonidas Donskis, is that in order to survive in this world of new media, you have to be either a victim or celebrity. And what Tony Blair is also said as a survival of the loudest. And my first small question, rhetorical one: what is the place for ordinary men in this kind of setting. And another is actually more fundamental question that I'd like to ask. I'm not sure what we're talking about, whether clean up Kabul, it means from Taliban or from garbage, or it's... Yes, yes. But the more fundamental challenges that the Western civilization faces are coming from, let's say, two sources. One is so-called Islamic State, which also harnessed the full power of social media, and because of this they are kind of developing, they're resilient, and basically there is no center in how they recruit, and all those migration stories that we discuss is just repercussion of the whole story. Another aspect of the migration story is this unholy alliance between Mr. Putin and Mr. Assad. Sorry for these geopolitical things, but they are, I guess we are like romantics discussing about certain things, how to clean the street. But hundreds of thousands have died not from the garbage, but from the action of particular people who harnessing the potential of the new media reality. And in Ukraine, people come in not because of the particular instances that happened on the street, but because Mr. Putin creates alternative reality with the crucified people, kind of children by Ukrainian army, and the real people are coming, and there are like well-educated, literate people sitting in front of all the social media, in front of this reality, this mediator that was created by these guys who harness, and maybe you've heard this book, The Folly of Net Delusion, and To Save Everything, Click Here, by Morozov from Belarus. My question is do you think, is it going to be in the long term to the benefit of the humanity, to have this kind of mediator in terms of that we call now social media, but this is whatever, media reality, which could be manipulated? Or at certain point, as also Zygmunt Bauman and Leonid Donsky said, that now the center of the evil has disappeared. Now evil is DIY. I mean, every person, there is no more Hitlers or no more, and in each and every person lives a small Hitler that could grow up. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that, in my opinion, and that's my question, and about the risk, whether there is a risk of this kind of horizontal community without specific leader who in the best intention are going to produce mass atrocities at certain point. Then the whole history of this romantic approach to technology, media, horizontal networks is going to disappear. Thank you.
Tough one.
I can say one thing, because I personally, it's my completely personal opinion, is that if you all just recently probably went through the digitalization of TV, yeah, before it was analog. So what I would say is that before, if analog is not in place, there is no hope for any digitalization. So actually, there have to be a mindset and willingness and culture, and it's not the technology that controls people, but it's still the people who do something with that technology. I can be 1 week without Facebook if it's my decision. I can be addicted to it. It's all about how you use something, and people have been manipulated with newspapers or with mass gatherings or with war throughout ages. Always people have been manipulated. It's just a new way of manipulating, and some old ways are getting less popular. It's nothing romantic about technology, it's just a tool. It's about you and me, how we use it.
I agree that this is definitely a risk, and you refer to all the studies that have been undertaken to describe some of the ways in which social media and other apps and technologies have been abused. And I think we're getting to a point where we have to show politicians that IT is a two-way street. That is not just a way to tell citizens that this is what you think, but it's also a way to listen to citizens and hear what they think. And of course, any politician that wants to abuse it will always try and do it for that purposes. But any politician that will want to regain the trust of citizens, and I think a lot of mainstream political parties in Europe are at that point where they are realizing they are losing votes, they are losing members, they will, and I've seen it happen in many countries, adopt all kinds of IT applications to do online voting, to do online policy making, so that they show to citizens that they are there listening to what they have to say. And you can never discount that some politicians, some people that have the means to really infiltrate all these social networks will continue to use that. But to throw away the baby with the bathwater by saying some of our leaders do that kind of behavior, so all IT is bad, I think is wasting a very important opportunity at this moment of time.
Andrei?
I think your question is almost philosophical, and it probably applies to any kind of communication tool that's been used ever since communication has started. But hopefully, if the people who predict the singularity theory about the exponential development of technology into the artificial intelligence taking over are right, we won't have to worry about this.
That's a good twist. You get one or two more questions or comments, and then we're going to need to move into the other panel with no break. There are a couple of hands there. I don't see much from here. Okay.
Hi, I just concentrated on the positive side of technology, and my question to you would be, okay, so you have the citizens that have participate in all these initiatives, and you as leaders of these initiatives, how do you reach out to those, let's say, staff in the traditional institutions? Do you build a bridge or not from your initiative? Thank you.
Thanks, Daria. Let's take another.
Okay, yeah, just basically picking up on two things that Meelika said. Firstly, you said that the challenge is to move people from online to offline. I was just wondering if you could tell us about how you do that when offline interactions can be very emotional. You've got the social side, that kind of thing. Clicktivism perhaps is less easy to motivate people to take a substantial action. And secondly, kind of following on from the previous question, you mentioned about companies becoming more like movements, which I agree with and I think is very interesting. I worry that because they're very well funded, they might solve some of these challenges, like how to activate offline actions faster than perhaps truly democratic organizations such as ours. How can we make sure that the people really have the power?
You go first.
There are three questions. First of all, do we build bridges? Yes. How we differ from many environmental organizations, without accusing anyone here now, is that we don't point fingers and we don't accuse. We are not saying that this is this municipality's problem, this is this party's problem. We try to engage via positivity. It's very, very non-typical for environmental organizations, which we don't consider ourselves to be. So yes, we build bridges, and it also connects to offline-online. Estonians back then used to be very much online, not much protesting, not much gathering in masses, very individualistic culture. So what we had to do is actually, in the online society where we had been online for a longer time than maybe some other countries back then already, for more 20 years almost, what we did was massively meeting with people and really talking face to face. And in communication, I think this is going to be the new trend. Instead of clicking and online, you actually have to start going where people are, trying really to work your butt off to explain yourself, to go out from your office and not communicate as a logo of somebody in social media, but try to really reach out to people, which is super difficult, but it's always more beneficial, and it's also more time consuming, but communication value is so much better. And
how to make sure, I didn't understand your question really well, how to make sure that the companies are not misusing the new...
I think the question was, how do we make sure, given the fact that they have the resources to do so, how do we make sure that we civil society, in a sense, civic, active citizenship, stays ahead of the game of companies when it comes to actually using the same tools to instrumentalize the energy of society?
I don't know. I think it's always like a police and a criminal game. Like somebody invents a crime, then the new technologies come to prevent the crime. It's some sort of an evolutionary spiral, I think.
Also in the civic society, and we are not there yet in democracy. We're still inventing everything. I think it's something to be invented. I'm looking forward to see how it develops. I'm sure that if somebody comes up with something very nasty, there will be another side that's going to balance it.
Well, I think they already have come up with things
Absolutely.
very nasty, and there was a response. But Sam, Andrei?
No, I think we're seeing that some of these startups or tech companies that are no longer startups are some of the most effective lobbyists in Washington, in Brussels at the moment. They spend huge amounts of money. So to say that the startups are the good guys, I think is a notion that has long passed. They're players like any one of us, some of them with more money than others, and I think we're seeing this in the US more than anywhere else. Of course, the role of money in politics there is extremely important. Maybe to say something about the online versus the offline, I think we a bit too easily talk about all the technological impact that we see around us. I agree with some of the speakers here. The offline is maybe much more important. Taking the streets, that is really what is creating the images that we see in newspapers. That is what is creating revolutions in some countries. That is creating the real change. So it's the old style, sort of going out there, being there physically, that I think is still more important, and that is aided, that is supported by a lot of the IT. We should not ignore the IT, but ultimately politics is about people interaction, and that is more done face-to-face than online.
Thank you.
For us, for journalists, it's relatively easy to describe how we can connect individuals with people in the institutions and public administrations, and it's a completely different stand from the one that you must take. We actually do have to point fingers, and point 100 fingers if possible, and then people are gonna leave their computers and go offline in the middle of the city and protest and burn stuff, and then the government is gonna maybe learn a lesson. We have a recent example with a case in the club that burned, where so many people tragically died, and it's the best example. There were investigations, people came out in the streets, the government fell. Of course, things are a bit more nuanced than this, but this is pretty much how you get people from in front of the computer to down in the street.
I agree, and I'm not opposing protesting. I have a huge respect for journalism. It's also my field of activity, after all. But you know, there are so many organizations that protest, and their only activity is protest. And there is a society who's craving for solutions. If you're protesting and pointing fingers, and I know it's not the job of journalism, but I see journalism getting more and more subjective instead of objective, taking sides more actively, like you do with your photos. It's not very objective because you went there with an aim, right? It's not like I'm just gonna bluntly show what's happening and not take a side and not try to influence. You try to be the watchdog, you try to make something with your work, but I also see that in many cases, there are a lot of people who say not even what needs to be done, what's done wrong. Try to correct yourself if somebody is always telling you, that's wrong, and it's not helping you to improve. So what we are trying to do as well, we're just part of the civic society. So we have chosen the niche of trying to offer solutions and engage everybody inside, also the companies and municipalities who are guilty of the situation, to be part of the solution. Because if they are not participating and we are only pointing fingers, there will be conflict, there will be accusations, it will go in a very bad politics, in a way that the organization will not be able to continue maybe in some countries. There's many ways to do, I think, update civic society in a newer level. I think all of these are valid.
Well, on that note, the conversation doesn't end, because throughout the next couple of days we're going to continue to discuss the thread, including through ideas like national service or online offline activation of citizen communities. But let me thank the panelists, Sam, Andrei, Meelika.